The ring didn't fit her finger right. I noticed that first before the preacher finished, before anybody said amen. The way she held her hand real still so the thing wouldn't slide off. That cheap brass band Cleet Harmon had pulled off his own finger 5 minutes before the ceremony as a joke. Somebody in the back laughed. I heard it. She didn't move her face. My name is Emmett Cord. At the time of that wedding, I was 41 years old, owned 160 acres of dry creek bottom east of Guthrie, had not spoken more than a dozen words to any person in the town of Beulah in the better part of 3 years, and had just been informed, while standing at the bar in Tolliver's drinking my one Thursday whiskey, that I was to be married in 20 minutes to a girl I had seen maybe 4 times, a girl named Dora Alt, daughter of Cal Alt, who drank away his saddle shop and his wife's patience, and eventually his wife herself, leaving Dora at 19 to sleep in the back room of the shop and do work for the seamstress across the way. The way it came about was this. Cleet Harmon and his bunch had been at cards since noon. By 7 in the evening they were loud and bored and out of money to lose. Someone, I never learned who, and it doesn't matter, someone looked up from the table and said, "I bet you can't get old Cord to say 10 words in a row." That got laughing. Then somebody else said, "I bet you can't get old Cord to do a damn thing, man's a ghost." More laughing. Then Cleet, who had a particular talent for cruelty dressed as comedy, said, "I bet a man $5 I can get Cord to stand in front of the preacher before 9 o'clock tonight." The pot grew. I don't know what Dora was told. I found out later she was told it was a real offer. That a man named Cord wanted to marry respectable and had asked about her through a third party, which was a lie, and that there'd be a small amount of money involved, which was also a lie, and that it would be a proper thing, legal and signed, with real terms that she could hold to. She was 19 and had $6 to her name and a room behind a saddle shop with a broken window she stuffed with rags each November. I think she knew it was wrong. I think she came anyway because she was tired enough to try. I was told it was a bet. Cleet walked over to where I was standing, set $1 on the bar in front of me and said, "Emmett, there's a girl wants to marry you. Preacher's waiting. You do it, you get $5. You don't, I get this $1 back and we all know you're yeller." I looked at him a long time. He was grinning. The men at the table were watching. I don't know what made me say yes. To this day I could not tell you. Maybe it was the year of not speaking to anyone and that hollowing out that happens to a man alone too long. Maybe it was the $1 on the bar because I did need the money, though that's an ugly thing to say. Maybe it was something else, something in me that had been still for 3 years and heard the word girl and moved before my head could weigh it. I said when. That was 4 words more than Cleet had expected. He blinked, then grinned wider and said, "Right now, Emmett, preacher's at the Hargrove Building." I put my glass down and walked out. The Hargrove Building was where the Methodists met Sunday mornings when the weather kept them off the road to the proper church outside of town. It had 6 benches, a damp-smelling rug, and a lectern that was really just a crate somebody had wrapped in cloth. Half of Tolliver's was already there when I arrived, which told me this had been planned some time before Cleet approached me. The preacher was a young man named Hooper, recently placed in Beulah, who I believe was told the whole thing was legitimate and never did find out otherwise, and who conducted himself with complete seriousness throughout, which was the only dignified thing that happened that night. Dora was standing to the left of the lectern. I had seen her before at the seamstress, once buying flour, once when her father fell in the street and she was trying to get him up without looking at anyone who passed. I had not looked at her careful. Now I did. She was small and pale, and her hair was pinned up in the way women do it when they don't have much time but want to look like they did. She was wearing a dress that I recognized as probably borrowed, a dark gray wool too large in the shoulder. Her hands were in front of her. Still. She was looking at the floor, and then she looked up when I came in and our eyes met, and I cannot tell you what passed across her face in that half-second. Whatever it was, she put it away fast. Cleet and the others filed in behind me and settled on the benches, trying not to laugh too obvious. Preacher Hooper began. I heard the words the way you hear them when you're elsewhere, the sound coming in but meaning arriving slow. Do you take this woman, to have and to hold? I said yes when he looked at me. Dora said yes when he looked at her quietly, not a whisper but quiet. Cleet Harmon produced the ring, his own ring, brass, which he'd been wearing for years and which sat loose on her finger, and there was the moment I told you about, her holding her hand still, the laugh from the bench, her face not moving. Preacher Hooper said, I now pronounce, and that was that. The men clapped and hooted. Cleet came forward and pressed $5 in my hand. Someone else pressed $1 into Dora's hand and she looked down at it, and I watched her understand, in that moment, the full shape of what had happened. I was watching her when she understood. She didn't cry. She pressed her lips together once briefly, and then her face went even and calm in the way that only happens when something gets locked behind it. Cleet said something, I don't remember what, something joking, and a few of the men laughed and began to move out. The crowd thinned. Preacher Hooper was gathering his things. In about 4 minutes the building had emptied mostly out, and there were just the two of us standing in the Hargrove building with the damp-smelling rug and the crate wrapped in cloth, and the sound of Tollivers starting up again across the street. Dora was looking at the dollar in her hand. I said, you don't have to come with me. She looked up. I said, there's the paper though, signed. If you want to leave town, use the name. It'll hold for credit, railroad passage, whatever you need. You won't have any trouble with it. She was quiet a moment. Then she said, is that what you want me to do? It wasn't quite a question. More like she was identifying a shape she needed to see clearly. I said, I'm offering a choice. She looked at the dollar again. She set it on the bench beside her. She said, does that offer a place to sleep? I said it did. She said, then I'll come. We walked out to the road. My horse was at the post outside Tollivers. I got her up first. She mounted without help, which I noticed, and then I got up behind and we rode east out of town in the dark without speaking, which suited me fine, and which she seemed to accept without difficulty. The ride was about 40 minutes. When we got to the property, the moon was high enough to see by pale blue light across the grass, the house black against it. It was not much of a house. I had built it in 2 weeks 3 years before with the intention of adding on in subsequent seasons, which I had not done. It was square, wood, with a porch that sagged slightly at the east end and a door that you had to lift as you pushed. Inside, one main room with a stove and table and 2 chairs, a back room I used for storage and sleeping in a cot. I showed her in. I lit the lamp. She stood in the middle of the room and looked at it. I said, back room's got the cot. I'll sleep out here. She looked at me then. Not accusatory, not grateful, assessing is closer, the way a careful person looks when they're measuring what they're dealing with. She said, you don't have to do that. I said I didn't mind. She went in the back room. I heard her sit on the cot. After a while I heard nothing. I sat in the chair by the stove and didn't sleep for a long time. 3 days she didn't say much. She rose early before me both of the first 2 days, which surprised me, and she found the coffee without being told and made it, and when I came in from the animals it was ready. She explored the house methodically, not nosily, just looking at what was there and where things were, and on the second day she reorganized the dry goods shelf in a way that was more sensible than I'd had them, and I didn't say anything about it because she was right. She was useful in ways I hadn't expected and hadn't thought about. I had been alone 3 years, and alone is a thing you stop noticing the weight of until there's suddenly someone else and you feel what you'd been carrying. On the evening of the 3rd day she came out while I was sitting on the porch, and she stood there a moment and she said, "What happened to you?" Not what happened to your wife, which most people in Beulah had wondered but not asked. What happened to you? I looked out at the grass. I said, nothing worth telling. She sat down on the step. After a while she said, "You don't talk in town. People think you're strange." I said, "I know what people think." She said, I don't think you're strange. I didn't answer. She said, I think you got quiet because something happened and loud seemed useless after it. I looked at her then. She was watching the grass too, the last of the sun on it, gold going amber. I said, that's about right. She nodded, like I'd confirmed something she'd already settled in her own mind. Then she went inside. What happened was this, and I tell it plain because it doesn't need dressing. I had a wife before, Sarah. She died in the winter of '83, influenza, inside of a week from the first sign of fever to the last. We had been 8 years married and we had one daughter who died at 4 months in the spring of '80, which is a thing I don't return to often. After Sarah, I sold the property in Kansas, drifted for a year, landed in Indian Territory, took up the Beulah ground on a scrip claim, built the house, and went quiet. Not because of grief exactly. I had done the grief. I had gone through it like a man walks through water, slow, weight everywhere, eventually the other side. What I had left after was something simpler and harder to name. The sense that the life I was supposed to be living had already happened, and what remained was just days. Work, the horse, the ground. I did not expect to feel anything again. I had gotten myself squared with that. I want to be clear about that, because of what happened next. End of the second week, Harlan Alt came. Cal Alt's brother, Dora's uncle, though uncle is a generous word for what Harlan was to her, which was primarily someone who had knocked her down twice in her childhood, and once borrowed money from her when she had it and never returned it. He came on a Wednesday, mid-morning, rode up to the fence with that particular posture of a man who wants something, and is pretending he doesn't. I was mending the south fence line. I saw him coming and kept working. He called out, Cord, I need to speak with you about Dora. I said, she's inside. He said, I'm talking to you. I stood up straight and faced him. He had a wide, flat face and small eyes, and the look of a man who had discovered early that bulk and loudness worked just as well as sense, and had never had cause to revise that discovery. He said that wedding wasn't real. Everybody in Beulah knows it was a joke. She don't belong out here. I said paper was signed by a minister and witnessed. It's real enough. He said she's coming home. I said that's for her to say. He looked at me like that was a strange answer. I imagine it was for him. I heard the door behind me. Dora came out onto the porch. She had flour on her hands, she'd been at the bread, and she wiped them on her apron and stood there. Harlan looked at her and said, Come on, girl. She said no. He said, Don't be stupid. He only did it for a bet. She said, I know why he did it. He said, Then you know this is nothing. Get your things. She said, I know what I know, Harlan. Go home. There was a pause, the kind that has weight in it. Harlan looked at me and then back at her, calculating something, and decided the calculation didn't favor him, and he made a sound that was mostly breath and turned his horse and rode back the way he came. I hadn't moved, neither had she. After a moment, I went back to the fence. She went inside. But when I came in at noon, she had made soup from the bone she'd been keeping, and she set it in front of me, and she didn't make anything of what had happened, and neither did I, and we ate. It was about a month in that I started to understand what she was doing. Not calculating, I don't mean that, but deliberate. The way a person is deliberate when they've looked at a thing clear and made a decision, and are following through without a lot of noise about it. She learned the place, all of it where the water was sweet and where it went brackish, which part of the fence the cattle tested in spring, how the southeast corner drained slow after rain and could not be grazed until June. She asked questions that were practical and paid attention to the answers. She started doing the kitchen garden without being asked, found seed I hadn't planted in 2 years, put it in careful rows. She fixed the porch step I'd been ignoring for a season. And she did small things, the kind you'd miss if you weren't watching. Set the coffee exactly the way I liked it, slightly stronger than most people make it after watching only once. mended the shirt I'd been wearing with the torn cuff without saying anything about it, put her hand briefly on my arm when I came in out of the cold one evening. Brief. Nothing spoken, just there. I started to watch for these things, and then I stopped watching for them and just felt them when they came. One night, late October, first cold snap, the stove working hard, she was sitting at the table reading one of the 3 books I had, which was not a Bible and not a novel but a book on soil and drainage that I'd ordered from a catalog 3 years before and read twice. She was reading it like it interested her. I was sitting across with my coffee. I said, "Why?" She looked up. I said, "Why'd you stay?" She looked at the book and then back at me, not the considering look, the other one. The one that means the answer is already known and the question is whether to say it. She said, "I've been surrounded my whole life by men who talked too big and did too little and took whatever they wanted and put the cost on whoever was nearby. You don't do any of that. You said I had a choice. You meant it. She paused. That's the first time anybody offered me a real choice about anything." I didn't say anything. She said, "Also, you're not mean, and you're not lazy, and you're not a drunk, which puts you ahead of every man I grew up around." I said, "That's a low bar." She almost smiled, almost. She said, "Maybe, but you clear it considerably." She went back to her reading. I sat with my coffee, the stove ticked. I went to Beulah in November for wire and nails. Tolliver's, of course, it was the dry goods side he ran to, hardware in the back. Cleet Harmon was at the bar, which he usually was. He saw me come in and he grinned and he said, loud enough for anyone nearby to hear, "How's married life, Emmett?" I bought my wire and my nails. He said, "She run off yet?" I said, "No." He said, still grinning, "Well, I'll be, Cord's got himself a wife. How is old Cal's girl? Still smell like that shop back there?" I turned and looked at him. He was waiting for me to be embarrassed. That was the shape he expected it to take, me red-faced, or dismissive, or making some distance from her to save my dignity, which would give him the thing he actually wanted, which was proof that the joke had legs. I said, "She's well." He waited. I said, "She's the best person I know." I said it the same way I'd said everything else, flat, even meaning it. The grin on him changed shape. Not gone, he was too practiced for it to leave entirely, but the enjoyment went out of it, because he'd been waiting for the handle to pull, and I just told him there was no handle. I took my wire and nails and left. Rode home in the cold. When I came in, she was at the stove and she turned and said, "There's venison, it'll be another hour." And I took my coat off and hung it up and sat down, and that was what home was. Here is the thing about being a man who has given up expecting anything. You become very good at not wanting. You wall it off. You work the ground, you feed the animals, you sleep, you rise, you do it again, and you make your peace with the shape of it, and you stop listening for anything more because more is not coming, and listening for what isn't coming is a kind of slow damage you learn to stop doing. Then something happens and the walls come down and you realize they weren't peace, they were just walls. What happened was this. First week of December, cold coming serious now, snow on the ground 3 inches and more coming. I was in the barn late mending a harness by lamplight when I heard her come in. I didn't turn around right away. I heard her come near and then she sat down on a hay bale behind me and she was quiet for a while. After a time she said, "Emmett." I turned. She was looking at me in the lamplight with that clear look she had, the one that meant she'd already worked it out, and what she was doing now was just saying it. She said, "I want you to know something." I waited. She said, "I know how this started. I know what the bet was. I know everybody in that room thought it was the funniest thing, and I know nobody thought about what it meant for either of us." She paused, "But I don't want you thinking I'm here because I had nowhere else to go." I said, "I know that." She said, "I don't think you do, not all the way." She was right, I didn't. I told myself she stayed because the alternatives were worse, because the dollar was gone and Harlan wasn't a real option, and the saddle shop was a cold room and winter was coming. I told myself a practical story and lived in it because the other story, the one where she stayed because of me, because of something that was actually me, that story felt too large and too fragile to lean on. She got up from the hay bale and she came and stood close, and she took the harness out of my hands and she set it aside, and she put her hands on either side of my face, rough from working and cold, her hands warm. She said, "You are a good man, Emmett Cord. You were a good man before I got here and you'll be a good man if I leave, which I'm not doing. I want you to hear that. I want you to know what that did to me. Not the way it sounds in the telling, not a story thing, not something dramatic. What it did was quiet. It went into a place that had been empty a long time, and it sat there like heat from a good fire, spreading slow. I put my hands over hers. We stood there in the lamplight in the cold barn with the horses moving and the snow coming outside, and I did not say anything because there was nothing to say that would have been equal to it. After a while she went back inside. I sat in the barn another 10 minutes just to be still and let it be what it was. The winter was hard that year. February came in mean, 3 days of wind that kept us inside, drifts against the fence lines, one of the cows difficult about the cold and losing condition. We worked it together. That is the plain truth of it, and there isn't a more elegant way to say it. We worked it together and we came through it, and when March came soft, there were 2 of us on the other side of it. The things that get built in a winter like that are quiet things, developed not out of any particular moment but out of accumulation. Every morning's coffee, every evening at the table, every repair done side by side, the shorthand that develops without discussion, the understanding of what the other person needs before they say it. We talked sometimes at night. She told me about her mother, who had been a careful and gentle woman run down by a difficult life, and a man who couldn't carry his own weight. She told it without bitterness, just clear, the way she told everything. I told her about Sarah, which surprised me. I hadn't said Sarah's name aloud in 3 years, and I said it and it hurt in the old familiar way, but it didn't break anything. And I understood something in saying it that I had not understood before. That carrying something in silence doesn't protect you from it. It just makes you carry it alone. She listened without filling the silence after. Some people talk you through a thing and some people just stay with you in it. She stayed. In April, Cleet Harmon rode out. He came in the afternoon on a Thursday, and when I saw him coming from the field I felt a tightness, not fear, something more like the tightening before a thing you'd rather not have to do. I came up to the fence. He sat his horse and looked around and didn't say anything for a moment. He wasn't grinning this time. He looked, I searched for the word and couldn't find a generous one, he looked diminished, like something had gone out of him between November and now. He said, "I heard you did well through the winter." I said, "Didn't lose anything." He said, "Good ground that east section." I said, "It's decent." He was quiet. The horse moved under him. He was looking at the garden, which was just showing. She'd gotten the early greens in, some of it already coming up, neat rows in the dark turned earth. He said, "She did that." I said, "We did it." He nodded. He looked at it another moment. He said, "I owe you an apology, Emmett." I didn't make it easy for him. I didn't say no you don't or forget it. I waited. He said it was a rotten thing, the whole of it. It wasn't a joke, it was just mean, and I dressed it up as a joke because he stopped. It was mean. I looked at him. I said, "You owe it to her more than me." He nodded, his jaw worked a little. He said, "I know it." I said, "Come back when you're ready to say it to her face." He looked at me, and then he turned his horse and rode back. I went back to the field. That evening I told Dora, just the facts of it, what he'd said, what I'd said back. She listened without speaking. When I finished, she was quiet a moment and she said, "You didn't have to do that." I said, "I know." She looked at me a long time, then she said, "Thank you." It was the way she said it, simple, like she meant it all the way to the bottom. Cleet came back in May. He came on a Sunday and he came correct, no horse posture, no grin, just a man walking up to the porch with his hat in his hands. She was out front. I was at the barn door watching. I couldn't hear what he said. I saw him say it and I saw her stand very still and listen, and then I saw her nod once briefly, which is the thing she does when she's accepted something and put it in the right place. He left and she stood there a minute. I went and stood beside her. She said he actually said it. I said I thought he would. She said I didn't. She looked out at the road where his dust was still settling. Then she looked up at me, and there was something in her face I hadn't seen in that precise combination before, something worn and warm and certain all at the same time, like a thing that had been tested and found to hold. She put her hand in mine. We stood there a while, the two of us, looking at the road. That's most of it. Harlan came once more that autumn, and I met him at the fence and told him clearly that he was not welcome on the property, and that was the end of Harlan. The place grew. Not big, we were never big people, either of us, but solid. Added 2 rooms, fixed the porch, brought in a second cow that did better in cold than the first. She taught at the Beulah school 2 mornings a week in the later years, which she was good at, which nobody who knew her should have been surprised by. People in town changed, the way they do when the initial story gets worn out and replaced with the actual one. Nobody made jokes about the wedding by the 2nd year. By the 3rd year, when Cleet had some trouble with a man from Tulsa who was trying to swindle him on a land purchase, he came to me about it, which means something about how the geometry had shifted. I don't tell the story of the wedding much. When I do, when some young man in a bar mentions it, because it did become a kind of local story, the sort of thing that gets attached to a place, I tell it straight. I don't dress it up and I don't play it for what it's become. I say, a bunch of men made a mean bet and 2 people came out of it with something true, and that's all there is to it. The young men usually look disappointed. They want the punchline or the romance, one or the other. What I don't tell them, what I keep, the way you keep a thing that matters, is the barn in December, the lamplight, her cold hands warm on my face. "You are a good man, Emmett Cord." I held that for 20 years, and I hold it still. Out here this morning, the lights coming across the east field the way it does in late spring, low and long and gold, and she's moving around in the kitchen. I can hear her through the window, and I've got my coffee, and I'm watching the light on the ground. We've worked together all this time, and I think. A wager started it. And the wager doesn't matter at all.